Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start the New Deal lecture. Yes, at 2:40 in the morning. Let's just go ahead and get this thing knocked out. Okay, so we're going to look at the New Deal, and I'm going to try to go very quickly with this. As I laugh, go very quickly. Okay, so the New Deal. This is going to start when FDR takes over. We're going to look at his actions and how they differed from Hoover, how they change forever the way we see the relationship of government to the economy and the relationship of government to the people, and then some of the most significant long-term effects. The Roosevelts are kind of an interesting case. First off, they were distantly related. Eleanor does not have to change her last name when she marries Franklin. She was Teddy Roosevelt's niece. Her dad was Teddy Roosevelt's brother, whereas Franklin was Teddy Roosevelt's third cousin or something pretty far removed. So there is a family tree there, but there's a bunch of branches between them, so it's not nearly as kind of icky sounding as, not nearly as icky as it sounds, I guess. Roosevelts are very much a political marriage. They get married, they form kind of this dynasty kind of family, have like 6 kids. Then she catches him having an affair during the 1920s. And it forever changes their marriage. She does not leave him. She stays married to him. But their marriage is never anything more than a partnership and a business arrangement from then on out. You know, he always liked the ladies, even when he's, you know, in a wheelchair. He has a number of different... He's got, let's see, he had the secretary that he had the affair with in the 20s. He's got another secretary that he has an affair with. He's got another second cousin that he has kind of a thing with. So yeah, he's got a number of ladies that he hangs out with. And so he's a little bit of a player. You know, and I tell you this not because really fundamentally for American history it matters or that it really changes who he is as a president, but I think that is part of what we have to think about. You know, in this day and age, we expect our presidents and our leaders to be so perfect. They can never do anything wrong. They can never have too much to drink. They can never have an affair. They can never, you know, say the wrong thing at the wrong time. I mean, in this day and age with social media, I mean, you put the wrong thing out there at the wrong time and you can lose everything. And I think we don't fully appreciate the extent to which, really for a long time, we've allowed our leaders to be human and to make mistakes. And so I think it's interesting to note that this was a political family. This was a political relationship that was extremely effective politically. Personally, this relationship was not very effective. It was very, very, very frustrating for Eleanor. And it was, you know, probably less frustrating for Franklin, but it was never, you know, kind of this love match, so to speak. And Franklin's mother she was crazy. Anyways, there's lots of interesting side notes about the Roosevelts that, you know, if you ever wanted to dig into those TMZ moments, they've got some. In the meantime, FDR wins the election. He provides kind of this energy and optimism. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. This is part of his campaign promise. And this is why his policies become known as the New Deal. He is very much, he comes from a wealthy family, kind of, you know, educated, I think, at Harvard. Very kind of great speaker, great personality. Had very much had this attitude that to whom much is given, much is expected. And I put on here along the lines of Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. And this is called Noblesse Oblige. And so he basically, you know, gets married to Eleanor. Eleanor had been, really, she had an awful mother who, you know, insulted her all the time, made fun of her because she wasn't, you know, perfect looking and all this kind of stuff. And so she's really kind of very kind of into supporting the underdog and people that don't have a voice. Politically, she's probably far more liberal and progressive than Franklin. And she becomes really his, especially once he runs on the presidential campaign trail. She's his legs. She's the one that goes out on the traveling trips. Traveling trips, redundant. It is almost 3 o'clock in the morning. And so she's really, she's the one that does all the traveling, and she visits with coal miners and with Black Americans, and takes kind of this, the pulse of America and takes it back to Franklin and says, hey, this is what's going on. And so she's a big part of who he is as a president, even though their personal relationship is not very good. And she actually relishes that part of her job. He was a New York senator, assistant secretary of the Navy, vice presidential nominee, New York governor, and, as I've mentioned before, crippled by polio. He believes in progressive, experimentation, result-driven, that kind of thing, and this makes him very popular. And then, of course, his success in New York helps, too. After the 1932 election, the inauguration won't take place until March, and many people are terrified that he's going to take the U.S. off the gold standard. Because, yes, the U.S. had been tied to the gold standard all this time. So here we have this huge economic crisis going on, and we're so tied to the gold standard, which limits our ability to borrow money, because, remember, we have to back every dollar with gold. And so it's kind of creating a concern. So it causes people to withdraw their money from the banks, foreign investors as well as people in the United States. And so it adds to the panic. So the winter of 33, tons of runs on the bank. You actually have a lot of different states that declare bank holidays. We're just going to shut the banks down, get everyone to calm down. And it was chaos, really, for a few months. This is a picture that shows you kind of what a bank run looks like. And it does. It really freaks people out. Then we see that the New Deal is not a clear, precise strategy based on a single concept. But it's really a bunch of different ideas all thrown at the wall to see what sticks. You kind of have two phases of it. You've got the first New Deal, which is in 33 and 34, the second New Deal, which is really kind of 35 and 36. These are kind of some soft dates. You're going to see that the first New Deal will be, you'll have this big flurry of activity after his initial election, and then you'll see it kind of starts up again about 1936 as the Democrats sweep into Congress. And you'll kind of start to see in 36, there'll start to be some pressure put on FDR, and he'll back off of some of his New Deal programs until you have a recession. And so, and you're also going to see about 1935, 36, there's some pushback from the Supreme Court, some other things. So these are just kind of some soft deadlines to kind of help you understand the difference. The big idea was just do something, anything. Try a program. If it doesn't work, go back to the drawing board. He creates his brain trust, where he surrounds himself with advisors. And notice that he keeps any one advisor from shaping policy, where you have FDR making all the final decisions. The names down below there, in case it's cut off, is Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes. I don't know that you have to really know those names. But what I do want to point out to you is I think I made this reference the other day, at least in 2A, because I know the early release day messed us up. But that there's some similarity between the kind of inner squabbling with the Nazi Party and the way FDR runs his administration. And again, I make this comparison kind of gently because I'm not trying to suggest that FDR is a fascist, although if you've read Part 5, you know that indeed, Hitler tried to make that assertion. But I do think that you can see where FDR surrounded himself with people and let them kind of throw ideas at him And he would gather up these ideas and choose what was best. In the meantime, he would let them fight it out with each other. And there's some similarities there in management style with all the different conflicts going on with, Hitler's guys, with Göring and Diels and Himmler and all them. I think the big difference, though, and this kind of speaks to the one essay question that you have, which is, I don't know that Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes and Harry Morgenthau, I don't know that those guys were privilege seekers. I think these are guys that really progressively want to do something. And so I think that that's really the big difference. And I think that the Nazis were very clearly, most of them, privilege seekers, trying to get as much power as they possibly could. This cartoon right here shows you FDR pointing out that it's evolution, not revolution. Don't worry, we're not trying to change the U.S. government. We're not having a revolution. This is evolving. We're evolving and responding to a modern economy. This was his defense, right? Because you have to understand and this is why I think, referring back to Larson, why they were so sensitive to FDR, this comparison with Hitler. Because there were people out there that were accusing FDR of changing our government, of taking too much executive power, of doing things he wasn't supposed to be doing. And, there were real concerns among some people, about what was happening there. I know, in fact, I think my grandparents were of those people that felt that FDR's programs were too radical. Even with the poverty, that they were in. So, this is a kind of a big deal. So him trying to justify why he's doing what he's doing. His first 100 days, you have this 15 major acts being passed all at once. Unheard of. I mean, we know how Congress can't even hardly pass a funding bill, let alone, dramatically change our economy. And so you see that lots of different things get passed in these first 100 days. You have FDR using fireside chats to talk directly to the American people. And that's primarily to help the American public understand what it is he's trying to do. That he's not, and I think that you see him using the radio in a way it had never been used before. And we certainly see there's other presidents, JFK is able to communicate very well with people. You have Ronald Reagan's able to communicate with people through the television. Obama's pretty good at communicating in the speech. FDR is really the first one to really effectively use this kind of consistent media. And the fireside chats were a big deal, and he didn't do them all the time. He wasn't like he did one every week. But I don't remember off the top of my head. Does he give 15 or 20 of them in the course of his presidency? Like all 3.5 terms or whatever? Where he basically communicates to the public, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And it gets support, right? So this becomes quite a big deal. Let's see if the inaugural address will pull up. Because this is pretty fascinating. Many people attribute the line in this inaugural address to Pearl Harbor. Oh, poo. Never mind. Let's see if we can't figure something out here. Let's go back to FDR. There we are. Let's try this one. Let's see. How about that right there? We're not going to listen to all 30 minutes of it.
We begin with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inauguration.
It's going to take forever. never mind. Let's find one that's not quite so awfully long.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. We must act quickly. And finally, in our progress towards a resumption of work, we require two safeguards against a return of the evils of the old order. There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money. And there must be provision for an adequate but sound currency. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures, as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask that Congress form one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that was given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
Well, I'm trying to find the line that I'm looking for.
This is a day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day, my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people entails. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to encourage retreat into advance. We face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. The will and need of industrial enterprise will buy on every...
Okay, so that kind of tells you we have nothing to fear but fear itself is the big line there. And I think that, knowing that this was what he was saying, and if you noticed in the first video that I showed you, he's talking about the fact that, he wants Congress to give him broad powers to make a difference. And so that's what we see happening. Right after his inauguration, he declares a national bank holiday, introduces the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which basically says that the federal government's going to license banks. They're going to either say, yes, this is a healthy bank, it's open, or okay, this bank's okay, but we need to monitor it, or this bank is unhealthy and we're going to pull out the funds or we're going to move them somewhere else. You have some banks that reopen immediately, some have conservators, and then on March 12th, the Fireside Chat, FDR assures people that the banks are safe, and then the next day we see deposits outnumber the withdrawals. So we see immediately the profound impact of the Fireside Chat. So the next big thing, and he referred to this in that first speech, takes the U.S. off the gold standard to provide a more flexible response to have deficit spending. So we are no longer on the gold standard, haven't been since 1933. The Glass-Steagall Act separates commercial banks from investment banks. So, you've got your banking accounts where you deposit your paycheck and, you spend money out of it and you don't make any interest. And then you have your interest-bearing accounts, and then you have your accounts that are mutual fund accounts where they actually take your deposit and they invest it a little bit. They also create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So never again do you have to worry about somebody coming in and, you saying, I want to withdraw my money, and them not saying, or them saying, we can't do that. So the FDIC, we still have this today. We still have the Securities and Exchange Commission to guarantee truthful information, that companies have to be honest with what their books look like. Now, that doesn't mean that they're always honest. Back, 10, 15 years ago now, there was the Enron scandal, and that one involved some people not being honest, but they got in trouble with the federal government. So we have the Securities and Exchange Act. Those are pretty big deals. We see very quickly the decision is to put money in the hands of consumers. That if we put money in the hands of consumers, they'll start buying stuff, and this will help with overproduction problems and oversupply. But there is a preference for a jobs program. The idea is that a jobs program at least preserves the work character. That rather than just having a flat-out handout, here's some money, go spend it. It's going to help maintain the American character. It's into this you have the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is the first big one. The CCC for young men 18 to 25 working for the Forest Service. There were some people that accused FDR of trying to make his own version of the stormtroopers with the CCC, which isn't true at all. But certainly you had these young men working. They lived in camps. They got paid wages. They had all their needs met. They got clothes. They got food. The idea being that they could send their money back home to their families. That's why it was focused on young men. Of course, the problem is if you're having these guys live together, you can't, you're not going to have blacks and whites living together. So this program was unfairly, shut out blacks. Of course, has nothing to do for women. So you see that the CCC is kind of the first of its kind. And it was very, if you're talking about the Forest Service and parks and that kind of stuff, it had a profound impact on that. There's lots of places, especially out west, where you can see where the CCC worked. But that doesn't put everyone back to work. This is a picture of them, some CCC guys. The next big deal, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, provided money to state and local direct relief efforts. Creates the Public Works Administration, which was a public works. They built schools, dams, sewers, that kind of thing. They contracted the work out, which means that you'd have a public works, a PWA project, and they would choose a contracting company, and they would tell that contracting company, okay, you have to be sure you hire so many, black Americans, that kind of thing, in order to make sure that some of those funds get distributed to all portions of society. So the Public Works Administration is a big deal. That has to do with contracts. The money goes to a private business, and the private business does the hiring. So the government's not quite the direct employer. There's a big difference with the CWA, the Civil Works Administration. They hire the workers directly. And it, again, builds playgrounds, airports, roads, schools. Tons of money. They spend tons of money. They spend so much money that even FDR gets freaked out. And they'll shut it down in 34. But it does get people through that very difficult winter of 1933 or early 34. The next one that we see is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, which buys bad mortgages and allows restructuring. We have the same thing today with the, what is it called, the Mortgage Assistance Program, MAP. MAP functions very much the same way. It does help those. It does help some. You have it doing 1 in 5 mortgages. The problem with the HOLC is that you had to have a job. So if you'd lost your job, you were out of luck. You weren't going to get an HOLC loan. But if you had your job, you could restructure your loan to help you keep your house. The Farm Credit Administration is meant to do the same thing as the HOLC. However, the problem with Farm Credit Administration is it's not going to be, it's going to help farms that, you know, are not very efficient. And remember, we've got farms that are overproducing. And we're going to continue to keep overproducing. Next big thing is going to be the Tennessee Valley Authority. This one's huge, absolutely huge. Government funding to build, to control floods in the Tennessee River Valley area, which is Tennessee, a little bit into Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, that kind of area. And they employ tons of workers, and you're going to see that they, you know, they profoundly affect the geography, the environment. I mean, they build these dams and they flood certain areas and other areas stop flooding. And it is, I mean, it is a flood control measure, and it has a profound environmental impact, but it also provides electricity for the South. We finally begin to see the South coming into the 20th century, thanks to electrification. And a lot of this is due to the TVA. If you've ever heard the Song of the South, which I may have to play here for you in a second, this kind of will tell you what the TVA is all about. This shows you kind of the area that I'm talking about. These are the hydroelectric dams. This kind of shows you what that area looked like after they built the dams. Let me go ahead and play for you real quickly, just because, well, you have to, right? Come on. Catch up with me. Thank you. My computer's not liking me doing all this stuff at once. Or maybe it's just complaining because it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Alright. Oh, nope. Now, Daddy got a job with the TVA. So the TVA has a profound impact on the South, creating jobs, creating opportunities, creating electrification, you know, that nobody had ever thought of. The next thing we see is NERA, the National Industrial Recovery Act. The big thing about NERA is it creates the National Recovery Administration. Now this gets a little bit confusing. This is how the NRA works. Basically, I, as a business owner, agree to follow the NRA suggestions, price guidelines, wage guidelines, and all that kind of stuff. And in return, I get a gigantic Blue Eagle logo that I can put on all of my stuff, right? So you have them doing that, and it's kind of like government endorsement. Like the government says, well, any business that flies the Blue Eagle is working with our government to improve our economy. The problem with this is, first off, it shows unfair preference for certain companies. What if I didn't want to be a part of the NRA? Then basically the government's telling people not to shop at my business. The other part of this, too, is that you have the codes being set by big companies. And these big companies structure these codes to kind of hurt small companies. And it just kind of, it's just not very effective. It hurts profit margin for a lot of smaller businesses. And in 1935, the Supreme Court will declare it unconstitutional, and they should have. It was not a good law at all. This shows you what the Blue Eagle looks like, and kind of what kind of the symbol meant, that basically people, this store is cooperating. And these are the kind of propaganda posters that they would put out there. Maybe when we get to the end of this, I'll try looking up some other videos. Also created by NERA is the Works Progress Administration, another public works program. This one not only creates highways and public buildings and that kind of thing, but it also employs artists, musicians, historians, and playwrights. This is where the first big effort to record slave histories comes from. There's this realization that the last generation that had lived during slavery was dying off, and they needed to record this. And so people like Dorothea Lange recording the migrant worker experience. And murals. Fair Park is a classic example of a WPA program. One of the reasons Dallas and Houston fought so viciously between each other to get the State Fair of Texas was because it was a big WPA project. And it not only created the buildings in Fair Park, but the murals that are on those buildings. So next year when you go to the fair, look at some of those buildings and remember that this had to do with the WPA and put these people back to work. You had theater, all this kind of stuff. Shows you some of that punk work stuff. The poster work promotes confidence. If you're an artistic person, studying the propaganda of the 1930s, whether it's American, Nazi, Italian, or Soviet, is fascinating. The imagery from the 1930s on these ads is just really something else. Farms, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, created, basically would pay farmers not to produce. And so by the time it's kind of similar to the sub-treasury plan that the populists wanted, except what they do is they start it, and they basically tell farmers, okay, we're going to pay you not to grow something, as opposed to we're just going to buy your surplus, okay? So what happens is that you have these farmers that destroy product, that plow under the fields, that slaughter hogs and just burn the bodies, rather than trying to feed all these people that are going hungry. You also see that if you're a farm owner, and let's say you've got some acreage that's set aside for tenants, what incentive do you have to let the tenants farm? Basically, you can kick the tenants off and get money from the government to not grow anything, and then you can continue to grow a little bit on your section of land, and you'll basically get to double dip. So you do see that it is successful in that it declines the farm surplus, and it does raise prices. But do you really want to raise prices when you have a depression and people don't have enough money to buy food? I don't know. And so you have commercial farms tended to benefit more than your average family farm. So the large kind of agribusinesses that were beginning to emerge in the 1930s, thanks to the bonanza farms of the Gilded Age, those benefit the most. And, I will say that the AAA does break the Southern dependency on agriculture. We begin to see industrialization become more of a factor in the South in the 1930s. But largely the AAA has a lot of unintended consequences of pushing tenant farmers off of land and really of encouraging people to go hungry more. And so really, if you're talking about, and I'm just going to kind of back up here, major pieces of legislation from the first New Deal: AAA, largely because it's going to be declared unconstitutional; NERA, NERA in part because it creates the NRA, which is declared unconstitutional, and because of the WPA, which is another big deal because of its kind of broad scope and its influence in public buildings. You're going to have the TVA, and its effect in the South, and hydroelectric stuff. The next big one is going to be FARA, which is the direct relief money. The next one after that is going to be the CCC, and then before that's going to be the big banking stuff, right? The stuff that creates the FDIC and all that kind of thing. So those are the ones that you're going to need to be familiar with. Where are we? Here we go. So Congress begins to move slower by 1936. This is an election year, remember, and so Congress is not passing quite as much legislation. And that's because people, there's by 1936, the unintended consequences of the AAA and of NERA are beginning to be seen. And you see that the Schechter v. U.S. overturns the NRA portion of NERA as unconstitutional, and that it's too much government control, too much government endorsement, affects unions because it can, the way it, basically if unions want to lobby against the wages they're being paid, they have to lobby against the government. And in 1936, the Supreme Court will declare the AAA unconstitutional as well. And that's because it's, paying people not to grow and telling people what to do on their land. And so the concern that FDR has is that this is going to threaten the entire New Deal, and that they're going to tear it down. And so FDR becomes very nervous at the Supreme Court, and you see him flexing his presidential muscle. And we'll talk more when we get through the New Deal about the court packing scheme, because this is a pretty significant deal. I guarantee you that they'll want to put something about this on the STAR test, because the court packing scheme is your classic example of, it's a historical example of separation of powers. So you'll want to be sure you understand that. But just know that this kind of period around 1936 represents the end of the first New Deal, because the Supreme Court starts pulling the brakes on. So just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so the second New Deal. After 1936, in 1934 you had more Democratic control in Congress. So you have kind of this 1933-34 where you have the first New Deal, they're passing a bunch of different stuff. And then by the time you get to 1936, you're going to see kind of in 1935, there's going to be an emphasis on regulation, broader relief, more kind of this limited welfare state. But there's all kinds of criticism. They try another 100 days after 1934, but they can't quite get it through. The big concern is that they had the first 100 days, and we still have a depression. It's not magically gone. And so you see about 1935 an increased reliance on deficit spending, which is called Keynesian economics. And you'll see that in 1936 you'll have a landslide victory. So clearly the general public likes what FDR is doing, but there's a lot more criticism of what he's doing that he's having to deal with. And so we'll see that his effective legislation is being slowed down. Challenges, despite all the created jobs through the TVA, the WPA, and the PWA, and the CCC, and all that kind of stuff, unemployment and low wages continue to be a problem. And of course, if you've read a little bit in Larson's book, you know how part of what the Nazis do is they take one job and divide it in two. So some of that kind of stuff is happening in the U.S. too, but that means people aren't getting paid all that much money. You have people that are criticizing FDR and the way the government has expanded his use of executive authority, especially because some of these programs like the PWA force businesses to pay black workers as well as white workers, and so there's some criticism there. And they're going to be all this concern about what is it going to do to the American individual and all that kind of stuff. And then there's a serious argument about the deficit spending. And this should sound a little bit familiar to you because we hear our politicians now talk about deficit spending. Deficit spending is when a federal government spends more than they're bringing in, so they're borrowing money. Okay? The United States currently has a very large deficit. You can Google it and see what it is, but it's something like trillion, gazillion kind of dollars range. So incredibly huge and outrageous. It's laughable. It's almost like not realistic, right? But this is the deficit that we have. Well, what does a deficit mean? A deficit means that your country is going continuously in the red. And, you know, like any business that tends to run in the red, just like an individual who borrows too much money, it throws up red flags. And sometimes banks can go, whoa, wait a minute, maybe we don't want to loan you any more money. Well, if you're an individual, they just stop loaning you money, and you've got to figure out how to buy a new car or finance your education or finance a house without, you know, having very many options. If you're a business, right, the same thing. You might have to shut your doors. But if you're a country, it affects your ability to sell bonds to foreign investors, to other countries. I mean, China owns, I don't know how many bonds of American dollars, because the American economy is generally seen as pretty stable. Although, if you remember a few years ago, Standard & Poor kind of downgraded our bonds a little bit, mostly to kind of as a political statement, I think. Because the reality is, you know, we have one of the biggest economies in the world. So, so all that to say that deficit spending is an issue. I mean, you have to be aware of it, right? Because if you spend too much on a deficit, it's going to hurt your credit rating. It's going to hurt what you can sell your bonds for. But the issue is that if you don't like deficit spending, then what you say is, well, we need to balance our budget, right? We need to not spend any more than we're taking in. Of course, if you do that, then you have to start cutting programs. And I'm not talking, I mean, we're not talking about just, you know, welfare programs. And certainly in the 2015 context. If you were to truly get serious about cutting deficit spending, you're talking about cutting the military, you're talking about cutting the war on drugs, you're talking about cutting money for prisons, you're talking about cutting money for all kinds of things. Not just education, not just welfare programs. Now, in 1930 context, right, this is about all these public works programs and all this direct relief money. And so you have people arguing against deficit spending, saying that this deficit is restricting investment, that it's making it hard for us to sell bonds, it's making it hard for people to feel confident that they can invest money in our economy, and that slows down business growth, right? That's the argument. And here's the thing about this deficit argument. It's not entirely wrong. Now, it's like everything else with the economy. It's all kind of mystical, and there's a lot of factors. It's never just one factor. So this deficit argument does have some validity, okay? And it has validity now, and it had validity in the 1930s, right? So the American Liberty League emerges as this pro-business lobbying group that argues against the deficit spending, that's saying that the reason why the Depression is continuing in 1935-36 is because the deficit spending has slowed the economy down. And so the American Liberty League is a conservative group. You know, if you're talking about groups that don't like deficit spending or criticize the government for doing too much. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got men like Huey Long from Louisiana. He was famous for his Share Our Wealth program, which was basically wealth redistribution. He promised chicken in every pot, and you know, he was going to cap incomes at like $100,000 or $150,000. Minimum income was going to be like $30,000 a year. I mean, he had this, very almost communistic, except he would have, you know, freaked out if he'd said he was a communist. Huey Long's kind of an interesting character. He actually gets shot and, you know, assassinated, anyways. But he criticized FDR for not going far enough. Upton Sinclair in his EPIC program. Again, collective farms, right? Kind of a socialist approach. Father Coughlin in Detroit. He was a Catholic priest who had a radio show. He starts calling for nationalized banks and heavy taxation on the wealthy. At first, he starts off really liking FDR, but then he starts, I don't know, he kind of drinks the Kool-Aid a little bit and starts saying all kinds of crazy stuff. And he eventually, the Catholic Church pulls his radio program and he kind of disappears. The Townsend Plan, which is going to be, the most familiar to us because it's a pre-idea to Social Security. Dr. Townsend advocated for a government pension to anybody over 60 to encourage them to leave the workforce. This would allow people over 60 to have money that they could spend, and it would open up jobs for young people. that the issue with all these solutions is that they're very simplistic, and they are addressing the wealth distribution problem, right? And they are trying to take care of, you know, individuals. They're trying to loosen up money supply, trying to rein in abuses by corporations and banks, and yet the economy is not one single issue. Even the Townsend Plan, for all that this is kind of the earliest, you know, idea of Social Security, and you know, it's not a bad idea. You know, get people who are older and, you know, probably aren't, you know, physically as able to work like they used to be. Get them to retire and give them a, you know, safety net so they don't have to worry, excuse me, about being destitute. But then you also put young people to work. But even that issue is only one tiny component of how to fix this overall problem of the Great Depression. So just to understand that in 1936, FDR is facing a lot of criticism from a lot of different people. And so I think that, you know, it's important to know that whether they're criticisms from the left or from the right. And so this is what we began to see. You have, in 1935, they begin to increase the tax on incomes and inheritance. A lot of people of FDR's social class consider him a traitor to his class. How could you tax inheritance? Of course, remember what Carnegie said, right? I mean, so you really kind of see the influence of Carnegie on FDR. More banking acts, another emergency relief act. You know, this part of it, none of these are particularly huge. The Emergency Relief Act of 1935 is notable in that it does expand the WPA, and most notably the National Youth Administration, the NYA. Lyndon Johnson is the supervisor in Texas, and the NYA becomes a significant tool to help both young men and young women, like 16, 17, 18 years old, get jobs. So again, you're seeing them targeting some of those groups of people that were left out of the initial public works programs. And the new WPA, the expanded part, begins to force blacks being able to get work. The biggest impact of the Second New Deal is going to be the 1935 Wagner Act, because it creates the National Labor Relations Board, and it's going to allow for arbitration. And you're going to see that it begins to strengthen unions. And so this is kind of our first big, you know, pro-union legislation. You do see a sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, thanks to the Wagner Act, which how it pushes for higher wages. The next and probably the most important piece of New Deal legislation from the Second New Deal is going to be the Social Security Act of 1935. This is going to be security for the elderly and unemployed. This is not welfare. Okay, Social Security gets lumped in with the Great Society programs of LBJ, and it is a completely different thing. Social Security, they take those taxes out of your paycheck every time you get paid. And the premise of it is that when you get older, you'll get that money back. So they take it out of your check, they put it into a large national fund, and they get, you know, returns on it and all that kind of stuff. Oh, excuse me again. And it's meant to provide kind of like an insurance plan for the elderly and for the unemployed and for, you know, orphans and that kind of thing. And so workers pay into it to receive payments later on. And it's not a charity because you pay in advance for it. So this is why they can't just abolish Social Security, because if they did, they'd have to pay everybody back what they've already paid in. Right? They're not going to do that. The big problem that they have is they don't protect that money from being used as collateral for deficit spending. So this is one of the problems that we have. And also the big problem that we have is the fact that you had a baby boom after World War II. And so we'll have more people pulling money out of Social Security than we will have people putting into it. And because the fund has not been well managed, you know, it's going to, you know, be kind of tight. So you still have, you know, it's not a perfect system. But it is certainly a new way of the government getting involved in the economy, and its goal is not to provide us with a basic living. The goal of Social Security is to provide a safety net. You cannot fall below this, right? It doesn't guarantee that you get to live a certain life, which is kind of what Huey Long was trying to do. It just says there's a level below which you cannot fall. You know, you don't have to worry about starving to death. And so that's kind of the purpose of Social Security. And it kind of puts the federal government in a relationship where it's supposed to take care of the most vulnerable people. Social Security Act of 35 excludes certain people, farm and domestic workers, which include a lot of black workers. You know, is that a wicked plan to attract the support of Southern Democrats, or is that just unfortunate? You know, you decide. So we have the Social Security Act. Social Security posters, again emphasizing that this is an insurance program. This isn't a handout. It's about creating security for individuals. So that takes us, so in the context of what's happening, you have the first New Deal and the pieces of legislation like NERA and AAA, which by 1935-36 are being found unconstitutional. You have in 1935 major pieces of legislation being passed, like Social Security. And then you had the 1936 election. You're going to see that, you know, you've got some tension going on in the 36 election because of the criticism, but FDR is going to win very handily. You know, and you're going to see him taking this 1936 election results and this landslide as kind of a mandate to really change things. This quote right here, I see a third of the nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. The 1937 inauguration is the first January inauguration. And you're going to see that he wins very handily in 1936, in large part due to a brand new Democratic coalition. And this is where you see kind of this strange, I mean, the Southern Democrats had always been a strange breed, right, going back to before the Civil War. They stayed a strange breed, where they don't like the federal government telling them what to do, but they're, you know, they have this peculiar Jim Crow system. And so they didn't always identify with, like, the populists or whatever. But because the Depression has hit farming so harsh, that you have them supporting FDR. Even as FDR is getting support in big cities, thanks to workers, he's going to laborers. He's also getting support from African Americans, because remember, a number of his programs are intended to target that specific group and get them to work, get them jobs. And so they turn away from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, that, you know, they had supported, you know, into the early 1900s. By the time you get to the 19-teens, most blacks are pretty fed up with the whole system, and they're not voting heavily. But when they do vote, they vote Republican. And you're going to have, you know, you're going to see that this changes dramatically because of FDR in the 1936 election. Women, in large numbers, vote Democratic now. You know, as opposed to, you know, if they had been the first election they voted in, it would have been the 1920 election. So, you know, they voted Republican. So this is a big change for women. And so we see that Eleanor Roosevelt is a big part of this because of her traveling and her reaching out to Americans of all different types. You have kind of an informal black cabinet where FDR has black leaders like A. Philip Randolph that he goes to kind of give him advice on issues for blacks. This is where some of the motivation to create programs that specifically target black employment comes in. You're going to see Frances Perkins as the Secretary of Labor, as the first woman cabinet member. And you'll see that, you know, FDR does a lot of things to help blacks, but he's also very cautious. Like, he does not support the anti-lynching bill. And, you know, so he does some things in favor of blacks, but he's also very politically savvy. seems to know just how far to push it, like with the Social Security Act. You know, we're going to push Social Security, but I'm not going to force them to pay that for domestic workers and farm workers. And so you have that kind of happening. And then, let's see, I don't know if this link still works. Let's find out. The issue with Marian Anderson, she was a black opera singer who, in the Daughters of the American Revolution, oh, no, it's unavailable. Okay, never mind. So anyway, she had, she was supposed to sing at this hall, and basically the Daughters of the American Revolution rescind her invitation, right? Because, oh, well, she's black. She can't come into our building. And Eleanor Roosevelt basically resigns her membership in this group and says, you know, I can't believe you did that. And so she ends up arranging for Marian Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, and very kind of early kind of protest movement. So anyways, other minorities, you have some response as far as Native Americans trying to kind of do something about the Dawes Allotment Act. It's supposed to be this awareness that, oh, gee, that's right, the American Indians, we need to take care of them. And you see women becoming a big part of the democratic machine. And yeah, the New Deal does a lot to try to focus on aiding and protecting women. Now, it does not try to push for equal pay. And so you have to kind of realize that. We also have the impact of desertion. Mexican Americans are ignored. Rural electrification, beginning in 1935, another part of the Second New Deal, is huge for the South because it starts to dramatically change. And just look at the statistics here. It dramatically changes the amount of electricity in the South and the West, which allows for the South to begin industrialization, allows for the South to begin to use air conditioning. And using air conditioning allows companies to say, hey, why don't, you know, we can make it through the summer there, so why don't we move down there and not have to deal with the horrible winters? You're going to have hydroelectric power becoming a big deal, even despite, you know, that there are unintended environmental results, of the hydroelectric dams, you know, but still, it's going to allow for the growth of cities. So these are major infrastructure pieces. You're going to see that some of the last reforms are going to be the National Housing Act to help create housing that is affordable, creates the Housing Authority. You know, but this is kind of the last big gasp of the reform, and this is largely due to Eleanor and her extensive traveling. Farm Security Administration gives loans to tenant farmers to purchase farms, primarily because of the unintended consequences of the AAA. And then you see that Congress doesn't really give it a whole lot of money because they're concerned about agricultural production. We see the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which finally, officially puts an end to child labor and also creates the 40-hour work week. And so you see these pieces coming in at the very end. Now, by 1938, we're kind of at the end of the New Deal legislation. But remember, by 1938, you've got you know, Hitler starting to get pretty noisy, and FDR is becoming increasingly distracted. So one of the things as you're reading Larson, keep in mind that you're talking about 33, 34. FDR's got a lot on his plate, so maybe there's a reason why he's not paying a whole lot of attention to Hitler. And, you know, we'll see that by the time you get to 38, he's turning his eye towards, you know, foreign policy stuff and away from what's happening at home. Which some of this, too, is that the Great Depression is still continuing to linger on in 1938. We still haven't figured out a way to totally fix this thing. And so this is part of the problem. So let's go back to the concept of the court packing plan. You're talking 1936. So FDR wins, you know, hugely in 1936. And he kind of says, you know, look, I've got a mandate from the people to pass this legislation to create this New Deal. This is what the people want. And I've got these 9 old men in the Supreme Court that are blocking the will of the people, and I don't like this, and, you know, we need to change this, right? And so he basically goes to Congress and says, I want to increase the size of the Supreme Court. He wants to increase it from 9 to 15. He wants to create age limits where once you hit, I think, 60 or 70, something like that, you have to retire. And if you choose not to retire, then they're going to add another Supreme Court justice. Yeah, sounds kind of crazy, right? So that whole idea is that you could end up with who knows how many on the Supreme Court. The idea being that encouraging you to retire so that that we need people on the Supreme Court that are in touch with what's going on around us, and that kind of thing. And I don't know that it's terribly incorrect. I mean, you look at the age of our Supreme Court justices right now, and it would certainly be good to have some younger people there, and to allow presidents to maybe, because if you happen to be president and you don't get to make any Supreme Court nominations, you have absolutely no impact on the court at all, as far as getting those appointments in. And then you get, judges like right now we got Scalia and Thomas that very clearly represent only a small portion of the American public and what they think. And yet they hold up a number of key rulings. And so I think it's, FDR's criticism is not out of place. Now, the problem with the court packing scheme is it upsets this balance of power. Remember that the executive branch, the presidential branch, can veto, they can endorse legislation, they are the commander-in-chief, they kind of, lead the country, they're the head of state. The legislative branch makes the laws. The House of Representatives initiates spending bills. The Senate, everything has to pass both houses. And the legislative branch can override vetoes by the president. And then you've got the judicial branch. And the judicial branch sits over here, and it is meant to evaluate laws and whether they're constitutional. And that's all it does. It doesn't create legislation. It doesn't enforce legislation. Those are the jobs of the other two branches. So you've got this balance of power. Well, if you have the president being allowed to stack the Supreme Court, especially FDR, because you're talking he would all of a sudden get to nominate, 6 justices, just boom, overnight. You would have really kind of an unfair advantage to the president. And plus there's this question of who are the Supreme Court justices going to be accountable to? So there's a real concern that this is going to forever change the balance of powers, the separation of powers, and the checks and balances system. And it's a valid concern. This plan had some problems with it. So the Democrats kind of split over it. They look at FDR and say, oh, this is kind of a power grab. Of course, keep in mind, the Southern Democrats are difficult, right? They don't like, they're racist, right? They don't want blacks getting any kind of privileges. And they don't like some of the New Deal programs that are helping blacks get work. And so there's some kind of reluctant support of FDR by the Southern Democrats. And so when he tries this little trick with the Supreme Court, he loses his Southern Democrats. And they begin to start acting like Republicans, which is what they will eventually become. So this kind of splits that group. The Senate will kind of put a stop to this. And you'll see that the Supreme Court will, stops declaring stuff unconstitutional. Is it coincidence? Did the Supreme Court, was it just really because NERA and the AAA were just bad laws, which they were? I mean, I don't know. That's for you to decide. But really, the court packing scheme hurts FDR's reputation. And you start seeing Republicans and Southern Democrats working together. This cartoon right here, cracking the whip over the judicial branch to get them to pull in line with the legislative and the executive branch. Very controversial move. Another blow to FDR's reputation after the '36 election is that he faced criticism that the deficit spending was bad, that this is what was holding back the economy, and so FDR kind of listens. And so you see about the time he wins the election, some of these programs that had started in the first New Deal are beginning to expire. And he lets some of them expire. He starts to cut some funding for the WPA and the PWA. At the same time as Social Security takes into effect, and they start pulling Social Security taxes out. So basically what you have is a pool of working people that have been used to getting X amount of dollars. All of a sudden, in late 1936, they're getting less X amount of dollars, right? They're losing either because maybe they've lost a job because the WPA funding was cut, or now all of a sudden they're pulling out Social Security taxes, and the economy starts to freeze up again. And all of a sudden, in the middle of a depression in 1937, we see unemployment increase. And so this just kind of, after 37, FDR is going to be like, you know what, forget supply-side economics, forget trying to worry about the deficit and the budget. And basically he says, we're not going to worry about stuff trickling down. We're going to support Keynesian economics. This idea that the government should prime the pump, that when the economy's bad, that the government should spend money, even if it means a deficit, in order to get people to work and get people making money, and that this will stimulate the economy. And then as the economy improves, you scale back the spending and you start collecting taxes. And so you see that Keynesian economics really becomes the economic system for the 1930s, and all over the world, really. And after 37, any attempt by FDR to try to, nod his head to supply-side economics is gone. You see that they kind of ignore that. But these are the two major economic theories that kind of influence the way we think about government spending these days. So it's very important to kind of have a concept for the difference between supply-side economics and its pro-business, business investment perspective, as opposed to, Keynes and his Keynesian economics and how all of that works. So the recession during the Depression, the economy collapses, unemployment surges back to 20 to 30%, and in response, FDR asked for another major public works bill, and it does start to put people back to work, and you see that the economy does start to turn around. Of course, also about the same time, you're going to see some gradual increase and some, a little bit of preparedness. Not that we're doing serious military, stuff. That's not going to really happen until 1939. But you do start to see, some increased production going on. And you're going to see after this increased funding, by 1938, 1939, you're going to see that Congress starts to turn against the New Deal. The Roosevelt recession will allow Republicans to gain some extra seats in Congress in 1938, and then again with their kind of coalition with the Southern Democrats will slow down reforms. And by 1938-39, of course, the issues in Europe are beginning to really kind of distract people. Classic 1937 cartoon, this is one rabbit that never failed me. Let's spend money. Again, kind of an implied criticism. The big legacy of the New Deal is increased federal power over the economy. You're going to have a broker state where you essentially have a government that mediates between different groups, whether you're talking, the state, the corporate level, the federal level, whether you're talking, workers in corporate, whether you're talking minority groups, whatever it is you're talking about. The government is kind of a broker. And it's going to create this safety net, right? There's this level below which you cannot fall. Everyone's guaranteed a bare minimum, right? Now, a bare minimum doesn't mean that you get to have, a free cell phone and, satellite TV. Bare minimum means you have basic housing and basic food, right? And of course, that's what we keep wrestling with today in 2015 is what is the safety net? What is the bare minimum that we believe people should be provided? And so that's what we continue to argue about. And this is where the argument over welfare comes from. Do we want to believe in certain types of, safety net, or is that too much safety net, not enough safety net? Do we want a safety net at all? That's what we keep wrestling with. And congressional power will diminish against the strong presidency of FDR. And so you have him being a very strong president, very strong leader. Of course, the 1930s is a period of totalitarian control. So, really FDR's version of leadership is far preferable to, say, Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin. But he's definitely a strong single leader. And you do have a growing federal government, just like you have everywhere else in the world. You have government getting much bigger, getting much more involved in what's going on. And so our big question is, how much should the government be involved? What do we expect from our government? We're going to see that the New Deal essentially lasts about 8 years. It does not bring prosperity, but it does help American morale, and it does lead to a gradual recovery. Middle class probably helps the most, but basically it touches all Americans in some way. Even if you were, an Okie in California, the New Deal affected you. And it does kind of take care of people that are struggling. Your very neediest people, the sharecroppers, the tenant farmers, the migrant workers, they tend to not get a whole lot of help anyways. But, it does do some pretty big things, even though it doesn't help everyone. But, maybe it wasn't intended to help everyone. In this kind of economic crisis, I'm not sure that you could. It's also important to note that it did not end the Great Depression. It did maintain capitalism, and it softened kind of this industry, this capitalistic impulse, with the strengthened state government. So we still have capitalism in place. It's just a capitalism that's regulated, that's controlled, that's moderated, brokered. Right, so the worst aspects of capitalism, as we saw it in the Gilded Age, are kind of checked a little bit and restrained because of the size of the federal government. You're going to see a new Democratic Party, this concept of action, let's do something, let's create a plan, and that the people turn to the government for action during the Depression. And we'll see that they'll turn to the government to stabilize the economy. And this is where you see the 21st Amendment. They undo prohibition, first off for tax dollars, but also because, hey, people are depressed and they're poor. And if they can manage to afford to buy a beer, then they should be able to buy a beer. And this is why the 21st Amendment kind of, undoes prohibition. Just some pictures to kind of remind you of kind of the extreme poverty. And that we're looking at people in all walks of life, not just white Americans. I think it's very telling to recognize the extreme poverty that some groups and Black Americans would have been, would have benefited the least from the New Deal. Global context, and we'll be talking more about that next. Dictatorships emerged in Europe during the 1930s. Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler. We have Latin America dominated by dictators. China has a weak dictatorship by Chiang Kai-shek, however you say that. And that will be invaded by Japan. So this is a little bit of the context, but I'll be talking about that some more here in a minute. And I'll go through kind of this difference between communism and fascism. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time right now on it. The U.S. begins to prepare for war by 1939-1940 thanks to the Lend-Lease Act. And this will truly end the Great Depression. And it will kind of lend a justification for the massive amount of spending. So you'd have this kind of conservative reaction with the Republicans and the Southern Democrats that kind of slowed up the New Deal. Well, by the time you get to 39 and 40, and you have to understand that FDR's had to fight his way through neutrality acts. You have, going back into the 1933, 34, the Nye Committee that says that World War I was the fault of, companies and banks that wanted to make money off of the war. And so we have the Neutrality Act of 35, the Neutrality Act of 37, the Neutrality Act of 39, all meant to try to restrict our ability to sell weapons to countries at war. Oh, and then it's on a cash and carry basis, and then we have the Destroyers for Bases deal, and then you're going to have the Lend-Lease Act. By the time you get to the Lend-Lease Act in 1939, 1940, The U.S. is effectively getting ready to prepare for war without actually saying, joining the war. And so it's this massive spending into military preparedness that's going to really end the Great Depression. And it's that, not the New Deal, that does it. But the New Deal does change the way we perceive government. It changes what we think about what government is supposed to do. So I think in that sense it is a very profound change. And so that's the New Deal.